Hi and welcome to this talk on British filmmaker and occultist Derek Jarman. I have called it Tripping the Dark Light Fantastic, some notes on Derek Jarman and his influence, and I hope that it will make sense to you. Sometimes I find it very hard to answer questions like, which is your favorite film? There are simply so many, and they come in so many shapes and sizes. But it is intriguing how some films never go out of style or impact. You keep returning to them time and time again, always finding some little detail or nuance you haven't perceived before. This rare quality of continually unfolding and inspiring of course exists in other media too. But I find it especially true for film, as the dissemination is such a strange and powerful mix of passive and active intake. I think we all have those films in our lives, the ones that provide some kind of spiritual or intellectual service that is more or less inexplicable. They lie hidden in the dark and occasionally shine a literal light that you need at that given moment. One such film for me has always been In the Shadow of the Sun by British filmmaker and artist Derek Jarman, who lived between 1942 and 1994. Its influence has been massive for me, much more so than Jarman himself. Although sometimes the reverse relationship is true when a creator becomes more influential than the actual works. In this case, his film has been ever present in my life and in ways I simply cannot describe better than occult. Meaning that the film itself as a unique artwork contains considerably more than merely meets the eye. There are substantial and exciting things underneath the surface. It has been a gateway to more information and inspiration, to more emotion and empowerment than I could ever have envisioned. The film was completed in 1973 and came to some kind of definitive finished status in 1980 when a soundtrack by Throbbing Gristle was added. Although Jarman had worked on big movie productions like Ken Russell's The Devils from 1971, working as a set designer, Jarman was always a manic Super 8 aficionado. With his small and handy Nitso camera, Jarman shot material with friends, at outings, journeys, and also staged performances that included scenography, choreography, and costumes. Using the Super 8 format's advantages, like inexpensive film and processing, very easy to use, just point and shoot, as well as disadvantages, limited control over exposure, complicated editing, Jarman refined his technical craft as stemming from or belonging to his cinematic vision. I believe that his frantic immersion also affected his vision as it progressed, meaning that he conceptualized new images and scenes as he had seen similar material before on Super 8. A kind of creative feedback loop in which form and content merged with this creative mind of his. And this was, I suspect, to a degree helped by knowing his own technology so well and using it as much as he could. An example of this was the Nitso camera's intervalometer, which allowed the user to expose the film at variable speeds, thereby altering the normality of perception when the film was projected or shown. I quote, "The re-filming and original shooting speed allowed Jarman control over the imagery, which produced a strong painterly texture and pulsating rhythm. The grainy streaked color effects is like a strong broad brush stroke and assisted by the degeneration effect of refilming. The colors are often softened and suffused. The rhythm is one which Jarman describes aptly as like a heartbeat, sensual, dreamlike and erotic." It's a quote from a film expert. When people talk of Jarman's work from the 1970s mainly, the first association will always be slow motion and grainy. In the Shadow of the Sun is exactly that, slow and grainy. It's a vision that evokes dream states in which we have a hard time hanging on to or understanding what people in the film are actually doing. It lingers, meanders, flows on, and we get caught up in a meditative beauty rather than any kind of linear narrative or traditional understanding. There are layers superimposed on each other, the colors are muted and saturated at the same time, and the soundtrack further amplifies a general and most uncanny eeriness. It's undoubtedly a work of beauty, however, one that attracts not by mere aestheticized eye candy, but rather by the evocation of curiosity, intrigue, and secret references. Jarman himself described the film as, quote, related to John Dee and alchemy, where the distinction between words and things is obscured by the identification of symbols with things, unquote. The film is quite simply a masterpiece of understated impact. I assume that most people will immediately dismiss or discard the film as experimental or pretentious. For me, it has always been a manifestation of a very precise kind of poetry, one that uses color, movement, chance, and playfulness, yet in a decidedly minor key, so to speak. Quote, "This is the way the Super 8s are structured from writing. The buried word signs emphasize the fact that they convey a language. There is the image and the word, and the image of the word. The poetry of fire relies on a treatment of word and object as equivalent. Both are signs. Both are luminous and opaque. The pleasure of Super 8 is the pleasure of seeing language put through the magic lantern," end quote. And that's a quote by Derek Jarman, from Derek Jarman. When I first saw Jarman's film in the early 1980s, it wasn't easy to come by rare experimental films or cult films, or the extreme horror films that I knew I loved before I'd even seen them. If you were lucky, you could possibly catch some screenings abroad at independent cinemas or cinematheques. But it was mostly the stuff of fantasy and imagination, with seed coming from fanzines and books that wrote about early surrealist experiments from Europe, or the new American cinema, or similar currents that flowed and ebbed. Then something very magical happened in the early 1980s. Video appeared. Suddenly you could buy films on VHS cassettes and play them in the comfort of your own home. It was expensive as hell, which of course created a booming market for second or even third generation VHS copies. If you were a diligent networker, which I was, you could soon see grainy, blurry copies with distorted colors of the films you'd up until then only read about. It was truly magical. As VCRs, or video cassette recorders, spread quickly, the market for all kinds of films grew, highbrow, lowbrow, and in between, and even for small and arty films. Several video labels put out music and films by contemporary avant-garde artists, and suddenly a new world opened itself unto unsuspecting yet curious teenagers like me. And one of the first films that I bought was Jarman's In the Shadow of the Sun, and I still have that original VHS cassette, just in case all other technologies should one day fail. I more or less immediately understood or sensed that there was more to this film than what met the eye. The otherworldly soundtrack had been created for the 1980 version of the film by Throbbing Gristle, one of my favorite bands. As with many bands at the time, Throbbing Gristle, or TG, were immersed in art, philosophy, culture, and occulture, and they widely disseminated references to authors, filmmakers, magicians, and other powerful protagonists of hidden histories. The merging of Jarman and Throbbing Gristle, for me, became a rabbit hole into which I gladly threw myself headfirst. There was an occultural hotspot or intersection right there and then, which already in 1981 spilled over into Jarman's work with Psychick TV, or PTV, Genesis P-Orridge's band after TG, and also Coil, which was Peter Christopherson's band after TG, together with John Balance, and the communal effort of them all with the Temple of Psychic Youth, or TOPY, the infamous magical order or think tank or occultural network. I started collecting information, books, music, as well as relevant films on VHS video, and the first and quite controversial psychic television videos included a short piece of propaganda called Message from the Temple, in which TOPY's focus on sexuality and sexual magic as a resistance was poetically stated against soft and alluring music by PTV. In the film, a man is sitting at a desk and then standing at a pulpit of sorts, but deliberately out of sync with the eloquent and seductive declamation that is heard, and holding a large psychic cross, the emblem or symbol or talisman of TOPY. I soon found out that this man was actually Derek Jarman, which just made this collective of artist magicians even more attractive to me. The art and information that was produced by these people was philosophically based, psychedelic, magical, alchemical, sexual, occultural, liberating, and very inspiring. I delved into it all more and more, to the point of becoming actively involved and working with TOPY and PTV, as well as initiating a friendship with P-Orridge spanning more than 30 years. At about the same time I got involved with TOPY, Christopherson and Balance had left to focus more on their own musical project called Coil. They continued working with Jarman on many projects, including on his 1985 film called The Angelic Conversation. And as in many, if not most, of Jarman's films, the theme had some kind of occult origins. Curator and British Film Institute archivist William Fowler said the following, quote, "He was always actively interested in the occult, and, among other esoteric volumes, he acquired an original copy of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 16th century work, The Three Books of Occult Philosophy. He was also very taken with the Elizabethan occultist and alchemist Dr. John Dee, a figure evoked in Shakespeare's The Tempest, hence Jarman's adaptation of the play. Dee claimed to speak with angels and used a black obsidian mirror to make contact with them. Jarman thought of the film camera as a modern equivalent, an occult technology through which to gain insight into the less visible aspects of existence and explore ideas about magic. Film is the wedding of light and matter, an alchemical conjunction," he wrote in his memoir, Dancing Ledge. End quote. As a thank you for Throbbing Gristle's delightful soundtrack for In the Shadow of the Sun, Jarman made the short film TG Psychic Rally in Heaven in 1981. It contains his signature style of multiple layers in saturated Super 8 in footage that was filmed at a TG concert at the club Heaven, with music from their album The Second Annual Report. Slightly later, in 1982, Jarman ambitiously documented the event The Final Academy in London, which brought together sources of inspiration like William Burroughs and Brian Gysin with younger artists like P-Orridge, Christopherson, and Jarman. Of this material, only the film The Pirate Tape from 1982 remains, showing Burroughs and acolytes hanging around on a pavement in London, signing books and chit-chatting. In 1984, Jarman made the film Catalan together with P-Orridge and Catalan surrealist Jordi Valls. It was shot on 16mm film in Catalonia and has a slightly different aesthetic based in strict montage editing rather than Jarman's usual meandering pace. The eerie music of Psychick TV fits well into this homage to surrealism in general and perhaps to the early work of Buñuel in particular. The same year, Jarman worked together with Coyle as well on a film called The Angelic Conversation. It was released in 1985. I quote from Peter Christopherson, "It was impossible not to be buoyed by his passion and energy. Soon footage and beautiful calligraphic notes started dropping into our letterbox. Of course, the images were wonderful. When the film was assembled, we all went to a studio on Camden to record the soundtrack. One or two set pieces were from existing Coyle albums, but most was improvised directly to picture. John and I constantly trying out new things on cutting-edge sampling equipment, and Derek bouncing around, burning sulfur bright as always, saying, 'Yes, that's good. Well, perhaps not that, but what about the sound of rowing here? Yes, wonderful, marvelous.'" End quote. It was Peter Christopherson remembering this in 2008. Jarman's Super 8 work, and In the Shadow of the Sun in particular, quite simply left a dent in my aesthetic and magical formatting, and it all still keeps on spinning. In the 2010s, I was getting more and more offers of teaching at art schools and universities, and my distinctly occultural focus in the classes had, and still has, deep roots within this formatted soil. On a more distinctly creative level, most of the personal art films I've made over the decades carry the same kind of Verfremdung effect that Super 8 in slow motion so elegantly provides, as do superimpositions and applications of the more or less random potency of cut-ups. At an art college in Cali in Colombia in 2018, I let the film Lunacy be the springboard for discussion about talismanic films and how to upheave the narrative structures and expectations in the most efficient way. Together with the students, we also filmed them one-on-one in headshots expressing their desires, but edited together the specific sound with someone else's headshot. I have also tried the same approach with students at a workshop in Skopje, Macedonia, and at the Royal College of Art in Stockholm. An important thing for me in all of this was to tie it all in with art history and to see how distinctly it also ties in with occultural history and experimentation. Meaning, what you are creating is not only art, but also a talismanic platform through which desires may or may not be processed. And that this is a living and thriving tradition, not just an odd intellectual occurrence in our contemporary times. Quote, "In 1974, I bought copies of Jung's Alchemical Studies and Seven Songs of the Dead, and these provided the key to imagery that I had created quite unconsciously in the preceding months, and also gave me the confidence to allow the dream images to drift and collide at random." End quote. The quote was from Jarman, of course. As in magical practice, the key to this artistic process is the upheaval of the rational mind and its attempts to structure everything to the degree that no room for the imagination or play exists. As in magical practice, you use your creative tools and abilities to change the perception of time and space, and to thereby open the door not of certainties, but of uncertainties and all their potential, albeit temporarily. Today, we're indoctrinated with fast-paced, causal, and perfectly CGI-maneuvered epics, either in commercial entertainment or more artistic approaches. Technology rules, for good and bad. More often than not, the tempo is high, or what could be called normal, and this is of course a zeitgeist phenomenon. If things are moving in any one direction, it's in the direction of higher speed. The fragmented culture that nurtures us, or the younger generation specifically, leads to an incapacity to grasp the irrational, erratic, slow, or non-linear. What cannot be immediately interpreted is discarded as quickly as it appears. Yet, it's only when the linear, rational, cinematic curse is upheaved that things get interesting. Today, to reach truly emotional or psychic states when watching a film, we have to go beyond someone visually shedding a tear or someone telling us what they feel. The cinematic language as such has been depleted by a tsunami of normality, media-based mediocrity, and visual technicalities. The American slogan, often used by people like David Mamet, quote, "The story is in the cut," end quote, no doubt stemming from writers like Stephen King and his massacre of adjectives, is counterproductive when it comes to showing or conveying deep psychic or emotional states of mind. Upheaval is needed. One contemporary curse is that technology enables such a multitude of enchanting possibilities, which I think can be quite negative. An analogous situation exists within music technology. When you have so many easy-to-use digital building blocks to choose from, does that stifle or encourage inner vision and ideas? Of course, this is not an absolute equation, but what signified many pioneering filmmakers was that they made the absolute most of the very little they had, very often conveyed through a cinematic language that was based on intuitive vision rather than pre-formulated statements or ready-to-use filters. I would argue, ergo, a most magical approach. Quote, "Painting is obsolete in a sense. It's no longer dealing with the world outside. What I discovered in film was community. I discovered my world in film. I wasn't the director of those Super 8 films in that sense. I merely directed the camera," end quote. Derek Jarman. The Surrealists were ahead in many ways. The early films of Buñuel, Hans Richter, Man Ray, and many others consciously approached the subconscious by violent yet poetic upheaval. Some artists like Cocteau even managed to weave in dream logic and visual poetry in more or less commercial films. And Kenneth Anger and Maya Deren used that too, slightly later, and also integrated distinctly magical elements and themes into their films. Although Anger often claimed to be mainly inspired by the very structured montages of Eisenstein, for instance, there is still a strong element of subconscious logic in there. And Derek Jarman always strived for poetry, even in his more structured feature films. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But the main thing is that he tried to retain and develop a cinematic language of his own. And in this, he succeeded. In the Shadow of the Sun evokes something magical, which doesn't need an explanation about how or why Jarman was actually interested in magic and occultism. The postmodern information or explanation approach is irrelevant, redundant. The work forcefully transmits through its own language. The film opens up a vista that is not necessarily filtered through will or concrete agendas. It's enough that it just is. In a similar way to how Brian Eno once defined so-called ambient music, there is no real end or beginning because there is no traditional narrative. Quote, "We might need those dreams and they might really be part of us, and that's what interests me about John Dee. Alchemy is about turning matter to gold, about dross and being, about dark dross being pure gold. And for pure gold, don't read capitalism, read gold in its spiritual sense, metal that doesn't corrupt. Of course, gold is the ultimate corruption." End quote. Derek Jarman. Many of my favorite films are intensely psychedelic, in part probably because the filmmakers were interested in mind expansion and intuitive explorations of form and color. This is interesting because it creates an aesthetic loop over time in which people get turned on to or by certain films and their languages while in an elevated state of mind, and the experience seeps into their own creative expressions, even within other fields or disciplines, which then goes on to affect others in a similar yet new way, and so on. When talking about experimental or poetic film, this seems to imply mainly an aesthetic perspective. It is easier to drift into the film form if there is no too distinct narrative function, and if it evokes a dreamlike feeling. But it's not an absolute statement, of course. The early Alejandro Jodorowsky films managed to do both, merge form and narrative content for a turned-on generation, as did Conrad Rooks with his film Chappaqua, or Dennis Hopper with Easy Rider, or even early David Lynch, and of course many others. I suspect that the reason we like films like this is the immediate resonance that comes from narrative upheaval. It doesn't have to be form-based. It can also be content-based, and perhaps it's even best when it's a mix of both. I think it's totally possible to try and explain what Béla Tarr's Werkmeister Harmonies or Satan Tango is about, but why would one? Why should one? The enjoyment comes from letting go and just being part of something that is not predictable, yet perhaps also thereby totally full of meaning. Where the story is strange, the storytelling perhaps ultra slow, and the audio-visual impact so compelling that you have to either reject or preferably immerse yourself in it. The feeling that you're part of something unpredictable leaves you temporarily open, and the cinematic language becomes a door opener in itself. Now the question appears, can this be used for something creative or possibly magical on a personal level? The opposite we know is painfully true. The predictability of commercial advertising and commercial television is there to close the door of critical thinking and creative behavior by seductive repetition. So the opposite must surely be true too. And indeed it is. It is totally possible to use the open state of mind to sow seeds stemming from your personal will rather than harvest from someone else and also pay for it. Basically, you make a film based on genuine expression and vision in your own aestheticized way. And you consciously plant something in there in form or content or both that will then be allowed to manifest via the viewers. I'm not talking about propaganda or exploitation of the audience, which has more to do with the psychology of commercial advertising. But what I mean is something more personal, something which doesn't need to be obvious or blatant. It can be a poetic trace of what you desire in a visual frame, a line or sentence of speech, or a contrapuntal use of audio in relation to the visuals. It could be anything that you decide and conceptualize. It's essentially the difference that lies in whispering, "I desire," rather than demanding loudly, "I want." In 2014, I decided I wanted to make a tribute to this very special cinémamour of mine. I wanted my film to be a tribute to Jarman's masterpiece, but of course for it to stand on its own 2 feet. Whereas the aesthetic grid is there and hopefully always will be, this film needed to be my own. How else could you pay tribute to such a strong auteur as Jarman? Having filmed a lot of material on Super 8 ever since my own glorious 1980s days of experimentation, I have accumulated a pretty vast archive. I have also collected other people's films and basically anything Super 8 whenever I've come across it. And I used this archival Super 8 material, shot some new, and made it all synaptically sensuous, slow, saturated, and superimposed. The soundtrack was performed live by my musical project at the time, Cotton Ferox. We improvised and recorded it in my band member Thomas Tibert's apartment in Stockholm, together with a friend, Joachim Karlsson Kurén, and we immediately entered an almost mystical state of mind. We had all loved Throbbing Gristle so much since early on. Incidentally, when I first met my longtime musical partner Tibert at a party in Stockholm in the mid-80s, I think, my spontaneous question to him was, "Do you like TG?" But we wanted to retain method rather than just sound. We just improvised attentively and without watching the film proper. And the magic of the moment would simply decide what the music would sound like and how well it would fit the film. And I'm happy to say it did. When I felt the film was perfect, I simply added the music and wham bam, there it was, my own little miasmic epos, encapsulating a spirit or gestalt I had lived and worked with for 30 years at that time. And I decided to call my Derek Jarman tribute Sub Umbra Alarum Luna, which is Latin for "in the shadow of the moon." When the film was released in early 2015, Genesis P-Orridge loved my Sub Umbra film and wrote the following blurb for the DVD cover, quote, "It's amazing. It truly captures the precise vibe of Derek's shadow in a way so perfect it could be a Derek film," end quote. And for me, it was one of those beautiful and synchronistic moments that meant a perfect circle had been drawn, as well as lived. Incidentally, in 2016 and 2017, PTV3, as the incarnation was called then, of Psychick TV, performed and recorded new music to screenings in New York and London of Jarman's slow-mo masterpiece. It seems the attraction never really fades away, but rather just seeps into impressionable and impressed minds, new and old alike. Thank you for being here and listening to my talk and declaration of love for Derek Jarman. If you would like to read the text, it has been published in my book called Source Magic: The Origin of Art, Science and Culture. I hope you will enjoy that book. I'm sure you will. Please also check out my other video lectures here at Vimeo. And if you want to support my work, please consider joining the Patreon I have together with my wife, artist and psychoanalyst Vanessa Sinclair. In the information text for this recording, you can also find many links of relevance that will take you to other expressions of my work. Again, thank you for being here, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.